This is Viewpoint with attorney and author Chuck Christmeyer. Viewpoint is a one-hour open-line talk show confronting the issues of America's heart and home. To express your viewpoint, please call 804-754-1988. That's 804-754-1988. And now, with today's edition of Viewpoint, here is Chuck Christmeyer.
The recent rash of marital failures among high-profile Christian leaders is forcing a showdown in the church, a confrontation needed to face down a mindset that, if left unchanged, will bring an onslaught of hellish delusion, writes Jack Hayford, pastor to pastors in Charisma magazine. It's time we take a hard look at why so many marriages, especially of those in leadership, are being torn apart. He said, there is simply no way to describe the present situation in lesser terms. We are at a point of crisis. Indeed we are. I welcome you to Viewpoint. I'm Chuck Christmeyer. Today we are going to grapple with perhaps the most difficult issue that we could possibly talk about here on Viewpoint today. This is the one that people all across the country just shrink from. I don't care how bold they are. I don't care how loving they are. I don't care how Christian they are. I don't care how popular they are. I don't care how seemingly in authority they are. They shrink from this topic like a shrinking violet. Today we talk about the subject of divorce and remarriage, particularly with focus on the issue of remarriage. Please don't turn that dial. If you turn that dial right now, and you have a situation where you're remarried or contemplating divorce and remarriage, or you have a friend that's dealing with this, and you turn that dial right now, you are accountable before God for what's said, whether you hear it or not. You are. Because ignorance of the law is no excuse. In fact, the very reason that you're motivated to turn the dial right now is an indication that you desperately need to hear what's going to be talked about here today. Today on Viewpoint, I'm going to read to you a very lengthy letter. Now, this is not going to be a sterile kind of letter. It's going to be the kind of letter that's going to really touch your heart. It's going to grapple with the deepest recesses of your mind and your heart. It really is. It's going to tug big time. Today we're dealing with a subject that has brought more hypocrisy to the church than any other subject that we could possibly talk about. In fact, it's almost like orchestrated hypocrisy. It's ordained hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy that has risen to the level of, you might say, a society-wide, church-wide rebellion and veritable conspiracy to hide from God. I don't know how else to put it. And it's leading us to what Jack Hayford calls this onslaught of a hellish delusion. He says we're at a point of crisis. And so today we want to talk about that point of crisis, how we got there, and how we can get out of it. I'm looking at a headline from the Barna Research Group in California. Born-again Christians just as likely to divorce as are non-Christians. A new study released by the Barna Group of Ventura, California shows that the likelihood of married adults getting divorced is identical among born-again Christians and those who are not born again. The study showing that most Americans reject the notion that divorce is a sin. And by the way, that includes Christians and their pastors. Based on interviews with a nationally representative sample, the Barna survey focused on the 3/4 of adults 18 years of age or older who have been married at least once. The study identified those who had been divorced, the age at which they were divorced, how many divorces they had experienced, and the age at which the born-again Christians had accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior. Researchers determined whether the divorce occurred before or after their born-again commitment. The survey also examined whether people believe that divorce is sin. Among all adults 18 or older, 73% of them had been married and 51% were currently married. That does not include the 3% who are presently separated from their marriage partners. Among those who have been married, more than 1 out of every 3, that is 35%, have also been divorced. 35% of all those who had ever been married were divorced. 18%, 1 out of every 5 adults who has ever been divorced multiple times. The average age at which people first dissolve their initial marriage tends to be in their early 30s. Baby boomers continue to push the limits regarding the prevalence of divorce, whereas just 1/3 or 33% of the married adults from the preceding 2 generations had experienced a divorce. 46% of baby boomers had already undergone a marital split. This means boomers are virtually certain to become the first generation for which a majority experience a divorce. It appears that the generation following the boomers will reach similar heights, since more than a quarter of the married baby busters, 27%, have already undergone a divorce, despite the fact that the youngest 1/5 of that generation hasn't even reached the average age of a first marriage. Although many Christian churches attempt to dissuade congregants from getting a divorce, the research confirms a finding identified by Barna Research 10 years ago, that born-again Christians have the same likelihood of divorce as do non-Christians. Interesting, isn't it? Very, very interesting. And the data suggests that relatively few divorced Christians experience their divorce before accepting Christ as their Savior. In other words, after they became Christians, they thought Christ authenticated their divorces and put his blessing on them. How did we get there? Any ideas? I not only have an idea, I know what the answer is. It's as clear as the nose on your face. It doesn't take a Philadelphia scientist or a Philadelphia lawyer or a rocket scientist. It doesn't take a theologian. It is simple, pure, plain simple. The answer is we changed our viewpoint on remarriage. Period. That's the number one reason. Until that happened, the divorce issue was well contained in God's house. But when pastors began to change their viewpoints, and whole denominations began to change their viewpoints, going back into the early 70s and then continuing on through the Gilded Age of the 80s and so on up to the present age, remarriage, a radical change in the theology of the church and in the practice of God's people since the beginning of the church. Remarriage after divorce. Never in history was such a thing permitted until our generation. And look what it's brought us. Today on Viewpoint, we're going to talk about the implications of this. We're going to take a look at the scriptures, and we're going to read a letter that will tear your guts out and maybe restore your soul. You're listening to Viewpoint. It's confrontation. We're confronting the deepest issues that touch our hearts and homes, from the church house to the White House, and most likely including yours. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Again, I welcome you back to Viewpoint. It's conversation with ever-increasing conviction. Today we talk about the greatest hypocrisy in America. The greatest hypocrisy in America and how to turn the tide. The greatest hypocrisy in America is the divorce rate in God's own house while purporting to be followers of Christ and crying to God for revival. George Barna, head of the Barna Research Group, did a study just recently concerning the matter of divorce in the church and around the nation. He found that among professing Christians, they didn't believe that divorce was a sin anymore. Although Jesus taught that divorce was a sin, few Americans buy that notion. Only 1 out of every 7 adults, 15%, strongly agreed with the statement, when a couple gets divorced, they're committing a sin. The vast majority, 66%, disagreed with that statement. Born-again adults were twice as likely as non